Welcome to the General Committee meeting. Declare the meeting open. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gubbi Gubbi or the Cubbi Cubbi people, paying respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. They have a number of items referred to the General Committee meeting this morning from the Planning and Environment Committee. The first item is the development application for material change of use, entertainment and dining business type 3 bar at 5-Toed Court, COOROY. There's a report direct to the General Committee on this item on page 3 of the General Committee agenda. Hello, Bill. Hello, Kerry. Welcome. Councillors, sorry. So the items in the Planning and Environment Committee agenda. Do you have any questions for staff on this item?
I do, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to ask some questions that I originally asked the Planning and Environment Committee because not all councillors attended that meeting. So just for the sake of clarity, can you explain, as I understand it, there is a situation where this is a distillery and distillery hasn't been built, and there's also a request to be able to have a bar as an ancillary to distillery. Can you explain whether the distillery itself has already been approved?
Yes, so the distillery itself can operate under under the approval that was approved in 2018, which was type 2 industrial. So the distillery business can go ahead and operate. The application in this instance is for the bar component. So in this instance, council determines that the staff have determined that the bar use is a separate land use and needs its own approval to operate on that same site.
And can you also explain the difference as what's in the agenda, or sorry, in your report refers to it's allowed to offer an ancillary tastings, but is not able to have a bar. That's the recommendation. So can you explain the difference between a tasting room and a bar, or what the two things? Yeah.
So a tasting area would be a small area in conjunction with that primary industrial use of the site, and it would be, as I say, a very small component. It could comprise of a small bar area to facilitate mixing drinks and that sort of thing, but it certainly would be of the size and scale that is truly ancillary to the industrial component, whereas a bar that is proposed at the size and scale is considered a separate use in this instance, so it needs to be scaled down.
So it's a size issue.
Yeah, and the primary difference we've drawn is the sale of alcohol. So if you sell alcohol for consumption on site, then it would be a bar under our planning scheme. If it's a tasting area and just offering free tastings, then we wouldn't consider it a bar under the current planning scheme.
And that's how it's defined in the planning scheme, the difference. Not clear.
No, there's no definition of tasting area in the planning scheme. There's only a definition of what's considered ancillary.
Okay.
So it just has to not constitute a new use, whereas a bar.
So what we've seen, for example, I know in other industry areas where, say, somebody was manufacturing food for catering purposes, but they were allowed to have a cafe where people consumed and bought the same sort of thing that they were also supplying for other purposes. Isn't that sale?
That's right, and so they have actually been required to apply for a cafe.
Right.
For separate approval.
Yeah.
If they're just making food on site for sale elsewhere, then that can constitute the industrial area.
And because I did ask a question that, thank you for answering by email, because in this case it's not wine or beer, you can't just taste gin, vodka, or you could, gin, vodka and whiskey, but in many cases the tasting would be more appropriate as a mixed drink. If it's not a bar, but it's only a tasting area where they're not selling but just tasting, can they offer mixed drinks for a taste?
Yes, they can.
And what kind of license do they have to have for that?
It's
then?
under their producer's license, which
correct.
is what they require for their distillery. So they don't need a separate license, it'd be the same license that's required to operate a distillery.
So yeah, my first question follows on that. So as a much the same as a winery would have a cellar door for tasting and sales, means bulk sales, i.e. bottle sales and the rest of it. The ancillary use as bottle sales would be permitted under the current activity, as opposed to bar sales with mixed drinks and the like being sold for consumption with food and with that.
Yeah, so essentially the intent of this tasting area is to provide an opportunity for the public and the like, restaurant owners, to come and try the product. The intent is not necessarily for it to be an open bar as such. So it's recommended to be, for the proposal to be scaled down, obviously to meet that sort of interpretation.
So the 3 breweries that we have operating in our industrial at the moment, do all 3 of those have bar licences?
All 3 of those have a development approval for a bar hotel.
For a bar operations, yes.
That's right.
Does the space permitted for that to be undertaken exceed the 20% of space that is permitted under the planning scheme for ancillary use?
In terms of their approval, no. In terms of how they're operating, one in particular probably does.
Right, but so if this was scaled down to no more than 20%, or I think we've even talked about increasing that in the Noosa plan to some degree, 30%.
Yep.
That it could be, if it could be scaled down to that activity, that would be more of an opportunity to approve the use as it or the application as it stands.
Not quite. So this proposal is under the 20%. So it's not necessarily the size of it.
The bar area, according to the report, is well beyond 20%.
No, that's incorrect. It is less than 20%.
Yeah.
That's not what the report says. Not in my reading of it.
Is there a page number
No,
in
it is
there?
less than 20%.
Sure that it said the bar area exceeded 20%. That's, I might have that wrong, but that was my reading of it first time round, and I said I haven't reread it.
So there's a quote on page 5. It says the applicant proposes the use area of the bar is 39 square metres, but review by officers indicates the bar actually has a use area of 55 square metres.
Thank you.
Is that still under the 20%?
Well, the applicant suggests on page 7 the proposed tasting area is 39 square metres and occupies approximately 20% overall.
Okay.
So
that wasn't my reading of the proposal. My reading was that they were exceeding the 20%, and that was part of the problem.
In this instance,
Yeah, you're right, Joe, in that the industrial use, if you look on page 9, there's a table there on page 9, and it talks about use areas. And the industrial use area is 170, and the bar use is 55, so that would be more than 20%.
Would be more.
Exactly. I said that was my reading of it.
Yeah.
That was one of the reasons for refusal, was that it exceeded the ancillary uses space. So I've got that correct?
Yes,
Correct.
it exceeds the 20%.
Thank you. So again, if that ancillary use of that bar area were reduced to no more than 20%,
it wouldn't overcome the other issues that staff have raised.
it's not the only issue, but it is one of the
That's right.
one of the issues. Thank you.
And I understand a couple of the other issues, and that would be parking for the purpose of that business, as well as the potential for what they call reverse amenity noise being caused by industry. Can you explain if this is intended to just happen on Friday nights and weekends, when probably industry isn't operating, why there's a concern about parking and about noise?
sorry, would you mind repeating?
Repeating myself, it's been recommended to be open, I think, from noon to midnight on Fridays, and no, that's Saturdays.
No, Fridays are 3 p.m.
3
onwards.
to 12, and the weekends 12 to 12 midnight. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Now, I'm just wondering why a couple of the reasons for refusal have to do with this being in conflict with the other industry activities on site in terms of parking and noise, when actually it's likely that is not a time when the industries are working.
That's correct. So as the report suggests, potentially that can be resolved by a condition or a number of conditions in relation to car parking specifically. Now the noise and amenity issues do not necessarily or not necessarily can be resolved by conditions, because in this instance the site comprises of 39 tenancies as we suggested in the report. So potentially there could be reverse amenity impacts given the number of other businesses that may be within that immediate vicinity, whereas the other examples of existing breweries, they're on their own site or share perhaps adjoin one other tenancy perhaps. So the issues or potential issues are far greater in this instance, or considered far greater.
But having said that, one of the breweries, from my understanding, has restricted operating hours and to facilitate not conflicting with existing businesses and the opportunity for parking to be utilised, on-street parking, the like utilised outside of the business hours of other operations in that area.
So the others were conditioned with their hours to ensure there was sufficient car parking on
So
site.
there was one in particular that had its
Yeah.
hours.
So that was the reason for the
yes,
hours
that's
in
right.
condition. The other sites are a little bit different to this one in that they do have their own separate sort of site. They have their own access, whereas this site has 39 tenancies. It's 2 out of 39 tenancies that's proposed. So it doesn't allow as much separation as the other approved industrial areas. One's a useful industrial area.
Any questions?
Technical one. So we discussed that environment, the fact that the Cody principle would suggest that we can place a fair bit of weight now on the draft planning scheme. And on page 11, there's a specific quote about the advice given by the Principal Strategic Planner. And in item H, it talks about food and drink outlets occur only where directly ancillary to and associated with bona fide industry activity on site, are limited in scale and extent, and do not locate on the western side of Gateway Drive or on land fronting Taylor Court. Now that seems fairly specific, suggesting there's a strategic intent not to have food and drink outlets. So my technical question is, am I right in suggesting that food and drink outlets are a defined use under the current planning scheme but not under the new planning scheme? I don't think there's such a thing as a food and drink outlet as a defined use under the Planning Act of Queensland.
Yeah. No, well you're right. There's different definitions under the current scheme to the new scheme.
So that is whether it's food drafting or otherwise, a reference to a food and drink outlet would include what we consider to be a bar.
Yes. No, a bar under the new scheme is defined separately to a food and drink outlet.
So is food and drink outlet a defined use in the new scheme?
Yes, it is.
It is.
We would have to check that. I think Councillor Stockwell might be correct.
Okay.
So he's talking about that the reference to food and drink outlets being like a broad reference here, and what uses under the new scheme would then fall under those.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll do the search myself.
Yeah.
They're separately defined.
So I have a related question also, and I think this is not for the development assessment staff, but perhaps for the strategic staff, so Kim perhaps. In the new Noosa plan, which is not yet, of course, finally adopted, there seems to be an intent to allow a range of this sort of activity in the Venture Drive Enterprise Precinct, and it perhaps also we've talked about as being allowed on Hoffman Drive as a brewery of this sort. Has there been a reason why, to me that is meeting the new and modern way of retail, and including multi-use where you've got manufacturing and retail and combining and that whole thing which is changing in our society? Is there a reason why in COOROY that hasn't been moved forward in the new planning scheme and been held in the old-fashioned way about industry, whereas Noosaville has kind of done a bit of a movement forward into the modern concept.
So the objective of the planning scheme around industry and business and emerging business models was, I guess, to find a balance. So still to ensure that we have adequate industrial land for genuine industries that need to be located where they might be metal manufacturers or mechanics or spray painters, those sorts of things. So we did work to establish what our industrial land needed to be and the provisions that needed to be in place to preserve those areas for those uses. And also, another objective was to look at what's happening, particularly in some of our areas in terms of the Noosaville, industrial estate, and provide some locality-specific provisions that reflect, I guess, what we were seeing happening there, and still provide some parameters around that still being core for industry, but some flexibility to allow those sorts of uses. And I guess this site in COOROY is seen more as to provide the more, as you say, traditional industrial areas, and that it was important that the planning scheme provide some provisions that both protect that in those areas. So it wasn't a let's look at all our industrial land and apply the same thing, because there are multiple objectives that we were trying to achieve across the areas and the localities and what the nature of the industry they were intended for.
But one of the things that that can be prevalent in an industrial, a true industrial area is industrial activities 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Whereas in somewhere like the Gateway Drive precinct, where the unit holdings are smaller, more boutique in nature with regard to their size, isn't that more along the lines of the type of development that's happening here with the multi-tenancy type development? That they're not large industrial spaces, although the other land holdings may be that, but within this land holding itself, they're smaller, multi-function tenancies with regard to their size.
There are some similarities, Joe, in terms of the floor plate and what's happening there. But like I said, a core objective of a planning scheme is to preserve land uses in the appropriate zones, and to preserve industrial land is a key tenet of our planning scheme. This location was considered to be more appropriate, as you can see, with quite specific locality provisions around providing for, ensuring we have available land now and in the next decade for those more traditional, if you want to call them, industries.
I'm just drawing similarities between the type of unit style complex within that precinct and this particular development overall.
Councillor Stockwell has a further question.
Yeah, I think I'm answering my own question, but so my recollection was incorrect. It must be the other way around. A food and drink outlet is defined under the Queensland Planning Provision version 4, and it is premises used for preparation and sale of food and drink to public for consumption on or off the site. The use may include the ancillary sale of liquor for consumption on site, but it doesn't include a bar, club, hotel. So the provision that was highlighted still gives an indication that the food and drink outlet would be discouraged under the new scheme in Taylor Court. Is that correct?
That is correct, but also a bar is identified as inconsistent under the draft scheme.
Okay. Well, having said that, one would expect in an industrial area that a food and drink outlet would be an essential outlet somewhere within the industrial area, so that the people that are working there would have somewhere to go and get something to eat and drink from.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. Given the distance out of town, there's probably a need for a lunch spot there. Certainly if the service station doesn't proceed,
Well, councillors, sorry.
I just do have one more. As we're talking about industrial areas and how they differ, there is another whole industrial precinct in COOROY. So if this particular development had theoretically been seeking to develop in the other part of COOROY's industrial area where there was a bit more distance between blocks and buildings, would that have been more feasible there?
Strategic planners here in terms of who did the provisions for that locality. Should like Michelle come up? She might be able to answer that one
Talking about
specifically.
Jarrah.
Yeah.
Jarrah Court, yeah. So I guess when we looked at COOROY, it was the same as what Kim said. You know, we looked at all our areas in terms of what should be preserved for traditional industrial development, and that includes land that's already serviced in good proximity to freight and rail routes and those types of things. So COOROY obviously is a location that has good access to the highway on those types of things, particularly in Androya. And I guess, you know, balancing out that and what we did in the precincts in Noosaville, we thought Noosaville has a location that's more, you know, closer to centres and public transport and, you know, more, you know, population that would frequent those more likely. So also, you know, we look at future demand for industrial land, and Noosaville is low in the future, whereas COOROY has a more, I guess, medium-term demand for industrial and traditional industrial land that allows those uses to happen. So
proximity to the highway would be a major factor in that.
That's correct. Yeah.
How does the demand? How did you know it had a higher demand?
We did some analysis for the state government, a broad scale analysis about industrial land we needed to provide for the land, industrial land SEQ plan. So that was part of our rationale behind when we were preparing the scheme as well.
One would suggest the parcels out there at Taylor Court and that the state have created are larger parcels of land in the.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
they are.
Than what you would find in our industrial.
Yeah, exactly. I guess they provide that diversity of land size if we had larger scale industry coming out.
Councillor Stockwell has another question.
Yeah, on last Tuesday, I asked whether the item B there, which was advised the applicant may wish to establish a tasting area that is ancillary but incidental and subordinate to the approved industrial use. Such an ancillary component would not include the sale of beverages for consumption on site. I asked, is there any way to provide a little bit more guidance around that? Have you had a chance to think about that, or do you think that's as good as far as we can go in terms of a motion in that regard?
So in that regard, it's suggested that resolution stay as drafted or as prepared there. The only clarification we do suggest is to include food within that recommendation as well, so the sale of beverages or food. So that was put forward in our email to councillors as well.
So there was some information sent around to councillors in an email just examining whether we could come up with a guideline for ancillary. We felt that the provisions suggesting no sale of beverages or food was quite a naturally controlling one to ensure it remained ancillary. We did consider whether we would try and place a floor area or a percentage on it. We were reluctant to do so and let that applicant consider that.
I would have thought the ancillary users would have put a percentage limit on it anyway.
We did consider putting a percentage and applying that.
I'm suggesting there may not be any need, because once it's ancillary, there is a percentage limit already applied.
Where does the
Isn't
percentage?
there?
No, there's none.
No, that's for retail sales.
Oh, you mean the 20% industrial?
The 20% industrial, we've already got a percentage limit.
Yeah.
So once it goes beyond that 20%, it's no longer an ancillary use.
Well, I'd actually consider 20% of a use quite substantial, and probably a little bit more.
According to the planning scheme, that's the ancillary use
That
limit, so it doesn't matter what we think, that's what's in the planning scheme.
Well, that's for the retailer sale of products from site. This is a whole other separate use, so it's, I know it sounds similar, but it's a little bit different, Joe.
Well, retail sale of alcohol by an alcoholic establishment is its retail component, one would think, as opposed to someone manufacturing leather goods, be the leather good item.
Yeah.
Councillors, we have a...
I have another question.
Yes,
sorry.
Ingrid.
I do have another question, and that is, I understand from having had the applicant contact me as a councillor that they had spent something like $15,000 in council fees and having a planner put forward this application when they were told they would have to ask for bar if they wanted this ancillary use. I'm just wondering if there would have been an opportunity to tell them this was an inappropriate thing to do and not to go ahead with spending that money.
So there was some preliminary advice provided to the applicant before they lodged it. It was a discussion, an email between council's planners and their planning consultant. The planning consultant chose not to have a pre-lodgement meeting, so that would be an opportune time for council officers to provide feedback on the likely prospects of an application, but the applicant's planning consultant didn't have that meeting. So they had lodged the application before there was really opportunity to provide any sort of further feedback to the applicant.
So there's no feedback in the emails that you just referred to?
Yeah, there was an
did it
email.
say?
It was a preliminary meeting, and the advice given at the time was that we considered the site may well be too far located outside of the town and didn't have good access, pedestrian access or public transport access back to town. So that was the feedback provided at the time.
Which is matched by the conditions that are in the reasons for review.
Yeah. And look, it was only a preliminary advice. It wasn't a full pre-lodgement where officers would consider it more fully. It was really only preliminary advice at that point.
Was that just in verbal advice, not
No,
in
there was an
writing?
email. There was
An email.
There was an email.
Was there a recommendation to go to approach for a pre-lodgement meeting before progressing in that email?
I'm just looking at the officer who gave that advice to know. I'm not sure.
No, I don't think the actual email contained such specific advice.
Okay, perhaps in the future, is that something we should be referring people to more frequently with regard to that type of, when we see the type of use being put forward, that we should be able to...
Yeah.
Well, we generally do.
Our planning consultants are quite aware that we have our pre-lodgement meeting.
I understand that, but if you put it in black and white, put in writing, then there's no sort of saying, well, you didn't suggest that.
We can do that, certainly.
That might be a way forward. All right.
Brian?
I shall move the staff recommendation.
Move Councillor Stockwell, seconder please, seconded Councillor Jess Glasgow.
Councillor Wilkie, do you want the additional, is Councillor Stockwell
What are you
want the
moving,
all
Brian?
food?
You want
Moving
that
that?
extra and food inserted in that?
Food.
On the screen.
Yeah.
All food?
Has it been seconded here?
Yes.
Just
Seconded by Jess.
You happy to include all food? Yes.
Yeah, that's what's on the screen.
Right. Councillor Stockwell, you have the floor.
Oh, I do so. The applicant submission on page 7 is something that I agree with, and that is that there is a reasonable expectation that the distillery would include a small tasting area to present, taste and sell product. The matter at hand is that we believe that the allocation and size of the area that they call a testing area allows for a use which is consistent with the definition of a bar, which I also agree with staff is not in the strategic intent for that particular industrial area. I think it's the item B clearly clarifies that we a ancillary tasting area with sales of the product being manufactured on site is consistent with the industrial use. That in this case it is just that it is not an appropriate location to do the same sort of thing as we have seen in a number of breweries in the Noosa industrial estate. And I think our new planning scheme makes that quite clear. I think new planning scheme does identify the precincts where we do try and encourage these more mixed use enterprises, and Taylor Court is not one of those. It's one where we are encouraging smaller forms of industry. I know that it's developing quite fast, and there are a lot of genuine industrial and trade-related activities going to be moving in there soon. So I think that is another important principle, that if you're going to say this is a place for industry, that we don't risk reverse amenity. And we also, I suppose, in our rural towns want to keep the activities like bars and other ones where you do want to attract people into close to where the services are in the town centre, not some distance away from public transport, away from any services that may be needed in terms of a licensed establishment. And so I think that that's a unfortunate but sensible approach to restrict the use to a tasting area and not to a bar.
Thank you, Councillor Stockwell. The councillors wish to speak to the motion?
Yeah, I concur with the comments made by Councillor Stockwell there. The proximity of the industrial area to the highway is one that is likely to attract businesses that are going to operate on a different timescale to perhaps other industrial areas, more transport related and the like because of the proximity to that highway. So I'll concur with the comments from Councillor Stockwell on this one.
Other councillors wish to comment? Well, I'm in agreement with the recommendation under not only under the current Noosa planning scheme but also the draft Noosa planning scheme. A tasting area is entirely consistent in an ancillary use with a distillery such as this on this site. A tasting bar not only is entirely consistent, it does not even need a town planning application, nor would it need a separate licence. It's entirely appropriate to take place there. A bar would be in conflict with the Noosa planning scheme and the future Noosa planning scheme, rather than if any of us wanted to approve a bar out there, this would not be the time and place to do it, but perhaps in the future planning scheme, via amendment, change the planning scheme to make it a consistent use. But as things stand now, the current planning scheme and the future planning scheme, a tastings bar is more appropriate. So I fully support the staff recommendation. Councillor
I just need to check something.
Jackson.
Kerry, I just heard a statement saying that they wouldn't need an additional license, but I thought from your previous email that they need a special producer's license, or is that the same license they have?
They just need one license.
One license for the distillery.
For the distillery, and that would cover them for the tastings as well.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Councillor Stockwell, wish to close? No. Put the motion. Those in favour? That's Councillors Jackson, Jarissa. What's unanimous?
I'll just let Council know we're having our planning solicitor review the reasons of refusal, which will have them ready for the ordinary meeting, so maybe some minor amendments.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Okay, thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go on to item 2, which is thank you, Michelle. A minor change to development permit for material change of use, multiple dwelling, 10 units at 142 Noosa Drive, Noosa Heads. And this item is the subject. There's a further report, Director General, isn't there?
Yes.
I'll go with the first question if I may.
Certainly, John.
Is it or is it not a minor change? I'm confused by all the information we've been getting. It seems in the last instance it's not a minor change. It is a minor change, sorry.
That's correct. It is a minor change.
So why the discrepancy with what we originally were told was not a minor change to what is now considered a minor?
Yeah. So originally officers recommended and advised council that it wasn't a minor change on the basis that some of the proposed car parking was on the adjoining property outside the easement. That's part of the guideline, the statutory guideline around a minor change. But we've had council's planning solicitor review the matter, and the advice is that it may constitute a minor change, given that it's only a small overhang, if you like, into the adjoining property. It's the same property, same owners. RSUV own both properties, and it may be considered minor. Really doesn't raise any additional impacts.
I might just also ask, and that's more for the sake of people who might be listening in the audience. My understanding is that since this application was put forward, there's been a new state-level koala conservation mapping put forward, and that actually has implications for this site.
Yes.
Can you explain that a bit?
Yes. Through the chair, councillor. Yes, it's been mapped as a koala habitat area under the drafts SEQ koala strategy 2019 to 24. Any clearing of koala habitat would need to avoid, mitigate and offset the clearing in that sort of hierarchy. We believe the current layout does not achieve that, so it's good to address these contemporary standards, and it hasn't been addressed in this current layout.
Can I just check? I understand there's a condition being disputed about the new Noosa plan, saying that that the new Noosa plan has been mapped based on council's koala mapping, not on the basis of the state mapping. So does council's mapping also have this as an issue?
Do we know?
Yeah, I have that. I'm quite sure it is listed, but let me just have a look.
Just to clarify, that's the same scenario that we've been talking about, the Shire Business Centre site, is it not?
Yes.
This is different though. This isn't the category X-Men. It's
No.
it's
That's right,
a
it is different.
it's
Yeah.
a remnant.
Okay,
So
all right,
therefore
so there is a different,
Yeah.
there is a different point.
In this instance, the changes to the regulations that happened in February place more of a burden on the site in respect to koalas. They asked for an offset to be paid, whereas previously they didn't.
So this application, which was made earlier, would still be covered by the new state legislation, which we are currently disputing.
Yeah, council is able to place weight on new regulations before an application is decided. So it's council's or the assessment manager's choice as to how much weight they provide to the new regulation.
So in the case of the area around Noosa Civic, we are arguing with the state that in fact council's original mapping is what should be valid and in the new Noosa plan, but in this case we want to use the state mapping as one of the reasons for not doing this minor change.
So does your question relate to the lot reconfig for me, or?
Yes, are we in this case using the new state mapping as a rationale for not approving, while at the same time in another scenario we are arguing that we don't want to adhere to the state mapping?
No, we're doing the same thing. So for this current application, the current planning scheme identifies the site under the biodiversity overlay. Does it map it as koala?
Yes.
And also maps it as koala habitat. The regulation comes in and also suggests maintenance of that habitat as well as offsets. The other scenario for the lot reconfig of the Shire Business Centre, the scheme mapped the site as biodiversity and koala habitat, and council were advised that we should give weight to that. You may recall officers indicating that because the regulation had changed, that may not play a big feature in the appeal. We'll probably more rely on the planning scheme for that one.
I have a question. The history of the site is, as far as I read it, is it wasn't made under the current planning scheme. It was made under the planning scheme from before 2006, 14 years ago. But it would have been 2006 or 2007 the last time the community had an ability to make submissions on a proposal on this site. Is that right? So,
yes.
The decision that this seeks to override, if we were to approve this, was to say no, enough's enough. You've had 14 years, well back then it was 18, 13, 12 years to develop. You haven't done it. If you want to develop this site, you need to put a new application. That's basically where our position is at the moment.
No, we don't need to decide that as part of this application.
I know, but that's our previous decision that's currently being appealed.
That's right. The extension to the currency is with the court.
Yeah.
This is about whether we can accept the proposed
So,
change as being consistent.
And they've done this before too. In 2008, there was representations made. Is that right?
Yes, they sought extensions back then.
In 2011, and then so we've had this running proposal. But when you get down to it, the principle that this is an impact assessable development application that should have community input. If you weren't living in this community 14 years ago, you haven't had a chance to have your say. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
The other element of this, for me, page 27 of the original Planning and Environment Committee agenda, the diagram, figure 3 there, has a comparison of approved and proposed building footprints. If the proposed building footprint fitted within the approved building footprint, would we be seeing this here for us today? Or is it still a matter of koala offsets and the rest on what will be cleared in that space?
Well, the change to the building footprint, if it stayed in its previous location or its current location, there's still a range of matters that the application needs to address.
Yeah, that's the question I'm asking you. If it stayed in the approved footprint, would we see it here before us today, or would it be, so we're dealing with issues of koala offset and the like, or if it stayed within its approved footprint, it wouldn't even be here, but it would be approved and continue on?
So can I just clarify the question, please, Joe? So you're saying if they would, it was in the same footprint, but they were making a change to the application by virtue of a change to appearance or the like, is that what you're suggesting? In terms of it being in the same footprint? Because, I mean,
if they were changing a layout within the footprint or something like that.
We would still be asking them to address the matters which were raised in the extension to the current application, by where we said that the material that had been submitted with the original application was outdated or didn't satisfactorily address.
Just clarifying that even if it stayed within the original footprint, we still have issues that we've got to deal with.
That's correct.
In the current film. Thank you. That's all I want to clarify.
Question. It's been flagged that there's non-compliance in terms of height of the buildings, and that elevation plans have not been provided. So, in the absence of elevation plans, is the applicant asking us to approve this development application without knowing how high these buildings actually are in reality?
Yes. They've indicated that the height variation is due to the minimum floor requirements of flooding for the site, which, you know, we do agree with some height variation for minimum floor requirements, but the issue is they haven't told us what the height is. So we can't approve a height variation or consider it unless we know what it is.
As professionals, would you consider it negligent to give approval without knowing what a height limit?
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
We wouldn't know what we're approving.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Further questions from staff? Well, we have a motion before us. The councillors wish to move the motion.
I'll move the motion.
Councillor Juricevic.
As recommended by staff.
Sorry, I just we flagged at Planning Committee that we had received amended plans from the applicant after this report was finished. Would councillors like us to go through those amended plans?
Yes. Between now and Thursday night.
We've got some plans here to show you.
Yes, please.
Now? You've got it now. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So on the 9th of March, we'll provide with these plans. Not an overly significant change to the current layout. What the changes involve now is that they're advising that all the trees, or the removal of the majority of trees within the development footprint to prevent conflict with the proposed buildings and residents visitors in the long term. We'd raised in the original report that whilst you're proposing to keep trees, the practicality of being able to keep them in terms of construction and then the risks that they may pose in the future would be problematic.
So they've acknowledged that and they talk about clearing all the trees regardless.
That's correct. The provision of a 10-metre wide koala corridor along the Noosa Drive frontage, which is to be revegetated with koala food and habitat trees.
That's the green hatched area.
And that's similar to what was identified as the replanting areas in the original application. There's been no supporting documentation provided with these plans in terms of any ecological assessment or stormwater assessment. And we had misgivings and concerns with the first round of plans that are before you in the application in terms of the capacity to revegetate this area in light of the bushfire management requirements, and also in light of the fact that there's an acoustic fence that's required to align with the frontage of the property boundary setback about 2 metres. They also have relocated the units within the site to provide a 3-metre setback to the existing open space area to the west, while allowing for access to the proposed garages and carports. Well, that is we've got a concern in that area about the capacity to provide linkage for the koalas for movement. We consider that the 3-metre corridor wouldn't address that. And they've made a change to the location of the visitor spaces to the north of the site to contain them within the easement, which would address that minor change issue that was raised in the original report. However, as we know, it would still be a minor change.
When you're talking about linkages, you're only talking about through the development, because there's a substantial swathe of trees, koala habitat to the left as we look at the diagram there that already exists.
Yeah, so this is one of the most critical linkages across that this is where they all funnel down to. Our koala expert has said you've really got to maximise the retention of koala food trees through this site, to otherwise Noosa's population pretty much will go extinct.
And there's another parcel of land across the road which is part of that connectivity, is there not?
Yes, that's
Has
right.
there been any suggestion of adding any other forms of connectivity through planning staff or through the developer with regard to aiding koala movements from that other parcel of land?
Well, our environmental services section did a body of work about koala connectivity and impacts on koala to koala infrastructure, road corridors. So there are suggestions along this about getting increased lighting and slowing speeds down through
Anything underneath or over the top?
No, they didn't go that far in investigating going underneath the bridge, which would be quite a good, but it gets water inundation. So yeah.
I actually meant under the road, but sort of, some of the major infrastructure change. But
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So could I relate it to what Joe was asking here? Just looking at it in the picture here, and I know this area well, we've got the RACV up there at the top of the picture, and then we've got quite a busy road, the Noosa Drive with the roundabout, and that continues through to the farmers market, etc. And what they seem to be intending to build here is between the RACV, which is already there, and the busy road. So where is it that the koalas let's say it's not there, where are they actually walking to and from? Where's this connectivity that is there?
Yeah.
Can you go there and
Yeah,
look?
sure. So the main activity is through this area, coming down through here. There's some auxiliary activity through here. There's a 10-metre setback, but it's primarily through this area.
And they go
here.
to where?
They cross across.
They cross?
Yeah, they cross the road.
There's another
Historically,
environmental
when we first started getting interested in the koalas in the 80s, the significantly larger population at the Noosa National Park would make their way through here, through the Noosa Islands Park, come down through here and end up in around where Noosa Springs is.
Yeah.
They would migrate in different times of year, and so that was the first time we ever heard the koalas ate Melaleuca incarnavia was down there, because that was different feeding arrangements. So that's that principal corridor for the coastal population, isn't it?
Yeah. So basically, by developing this area in this current footprint, you'd only be reliant on
The wetland.
And would that other side of it travel to where they are going?
Sorry.
If it's with the development, would the koalas have access through that other continue being able to walk to where they're going?
Well, whether there's enough food resources there, or because you're basically going, cutting 2/3 of the area around.
Yeah, it's not considered sufficient.
And it's wetlands to the left?
Yes.
Well, it's wetlands, it's not this food habitat area.
There are eucalypts.
There are eucalypts in there, but it's it filters down into wetland area.
Yeah. Well, mangroves and
So Patrick, can I ask another question? What was the point you made about acoustic fencing before? I didn't quite grasp that.
The original approval requires an acoustic fence adjacent to the front boundary within 2 metres of the Noosa Drive boundary. So the construction of that fence is likely to compromise existing food trees in that area, and the opportunity, I would presume, for further planting in there as well. So they're not demonstrating that they've got sufficient area to accommodate all the constraints in that area to provide the corridor.
So will the fencing go ahead or not?
It's likely that the fence would have to be set back the 10 metres to allow for that corridor along the front to facilitate koalas crossing Noosa Drive.
And that would be consistent with what's in the existing development, which is a 10 metre setback with a pathway.
That's right. Yeah.
Currently it's required to be 2 metres.
Currently, that's right.
But it's preferred to be 10 metres.
Yes, RSCV fencing is set back 10 metres. So it's got a corridor along Noosa Drive, so that's what we're looking for here. And it just facilitates the crossing of koalas across the road.
We've moved by Joe. Is there seconded Councillor Glasgow?
Oh, sorry.
There's more.
There's more.
There's more.
So we did meet with the applicants last week and to relay our concerns with the plans, the amended set of them that have been put forward. And then on Friday morning we got another set of plans, or another site plan, which is now on the screen.
Oh, that's different.
So
More spread out.
the change in this instance is actually the corridor to Noosa Drive has been reduced from 10 metres to 8 metres. They have provided an 8 metre corridor to the southwest. They have intruded into the open space conservation zone. There is patio encroachments to units 2, 3 and 4 into the 8 metre southwestern linkage, and they advised that subject to further advice from a water quality expert, they believe they could get some treatment in between units 1 and 2. Obviously you've not had a lot of time to review these, but having a look at it can certainly see similar concerns with the current proposal and the amended plans. It's interesting that the setback to Noosa Drive's been reduced to further compromise that linkage. Initial review of the linkage to the southwest is that's still of a concern. They haven't demonstrated that that's going to be satisfactory.
So these two new plans really don't address all the issues that the report raises. So the recommendation remains the same. We've suggested to the applicant that it's good, they want to keep working with us to try and find a layout that works, but they really need to withdraw their current change application and start again.
They seem to be reactive in nature with regards to trying to find something in the short term to appease staff sufficiently.
And your preferred position would be that a new application is made, be a material change of use, impact accessible?
Ideally a new application would be made, that's right. That's right, impact accessible.
And why would it need to be MCU impact accessible? Just if you could explain.
Yeah, because the planning scheme identifies the assessment type for all development, and the scheme would require impact assessment for this site.
Because what's the zoning for this site?
Well, the zoning's got a mixed zoning. Yeah. Currently it's
open space conservation and
semi-attached housing. Yeah, but the scheme calls up impact assessment, so when we consider the development on the site, we can really consider the impacts of the proposed development.
Because of the significance of the site?
Yeah, it's quite a significant site, very significant for koalas, and it's very prominent on Noosa Drive as well. Yeah. So
is there anything else we need to know about subsequent?
No, there's no more plans.
Have you rushed to?
No, I'll just ask a question now.
I will just remind councillors that we are required by the court to decide this by the 20th of March. That is the mediation agreement. So whilst the applicant wants to continue discussing plans, which is good, we have a court date that we have to meet. So it's important that we do make a decision now if they don't withdraw the current application.
So from what Councillor Wilkie was asking you about, have you pronounced in some way that it would be appropriate for them to put forward an application for a material change of use, which was impact accessible?
Yes, we've proposed that they should, because there's been discussions, there's been 2 meetings about a new application, and we have suggested that they proceed with that application. They are keen though to try and maintain this approval, as all developers like to do. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. So we've also talked to them about ideas that officers have as to how they might best meet the scheme requirements on this site. So we've put forward a number of ideas for them to consider, but we're not there yet.
Okay, because I'm just conscious that we were just talking about the COOROY application that cost so much money and got knocked back. And similarly, if council were inviting an application which is most likely to be knocked back, I would just question having that kind of approach. If it's something that is unlikely to be viable according to all these issues to do with koala habitat and biodiversity.
Yeah, well, the site can be developed. It is zoned for unit development, so council could not refuse all development on this site. You know, there is some development that should happen on the site, and that would be consistent with the scheme. So I'm not going to discourage any application for unit developments because it's a consistent use on the site. Unlike the bar in COOROY, that was an inconsistent use for the industrial
So how
zoning.
could this be acceptable if so far they seem to have given us several options and it's, you're now saying it's consistent but it's being knocked back? How could it then be acceptable?
By changing the layout around to maintain that corridor through the site, and you know, adjacent, well, we think the side that's closest to Noosa Inlet, and really maintain that corridor and widen that. So it may mean they might reduce the number of units down, or come up with an alternative layout.
Would you also recommend some more specifics around building heights?
Yes, we've certainly had that discussion with them.
So you need to be certain about what
That's
height,
right.
what height buildings are
Yeah.
going to be.
Yep.
Any further questions of staff about the amended plans?
Mr. Chairman, I do note that the motion has been moved and seconded, and it actually isn't under the standing orders acceptable to keep questioning.
Well, it hasn't. We don't have a seconder up there.
Councillor Glasgow did allude that he would second it before he left the room.
He didn't actually say.
Didn't he? You didn't record that?
No,
Okay.
I didn't.
No,
I
I'm
didn't
sorry.
second it. Sorry.
Yeah.
More questions, Brian? Or?
No, I was just pulling you out.
Okay. All right. Councillor Jurisiewicz, you wish to?
Yeah, look, I support the staff recommendation on this one. I can see that the size and scale of the applicant's intent on this site that is the challenge. A slightly scaled down proposal here could easily meet the approvals or the approval area of the site, not encroach on the environmental outcomes that are intended for his for Koala Corridor. And I see that this the need for 10 units in this area is of the size they are is the challenge in trying to fit it within this pass. I think the applicant needs to go back to the drawing board and look at the size and scale of their development in this instance.
So my key point, which I focus my question on, is the principle of planning for high-profile sites with uses that impact accessible is that we as council consider the submissions made by the community. The community hasn't had the chance to make a submission since 2006 or thereabouts. The community has changed significantly since 2006 and thereabouts. Legislation and requirements is constantly changing. I bring council's attention to another high-profile development site where it was extended during this term of council, where the community was very upset that we didn't look at it from the perspective of the threatened species that occurs on it. That didn't come to council per se, but it was a council decision. This is very similar in its context. It is one of the highest profile remnant koala sites in Noosa, in the coastal part of Noosa. For those who've been around a long time, it's not just development that are impacting on the koalas. That section of road there has probably had more koala injuries and deaths than anywhere else I know of in the coast. So yes, there is probably a need to look at infrastructure as well across the road. But for me, that is the principle, that this site hasn't been developed, hasn't had the community input since for well over a decade, and that is essential for me to make an informed decision about any development on this site, and therefore I support the staff recommendation.
Okay. Ms. Glasgow. Councillor Glasgow's taken another phone call and left the chamber.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
Any other councillors wish to speak to the motion?
Well, I might actually just say that I think we've obviously, as a council, seen this previously, and there are quite a lot of reasons for not approving, and I'm certainly understanding that. I'm also keen to support development where it's zoned appropriately, and so the concept of having discussions seems to be the most important element, because it's not satisfactory to encourage people to apply and then knock them back. And I think a solution has to be found that they can then put an application forward that's appropriate for the area.
Yes, look, I support the staff recommendation for the reasons mentioned about the work that needs to be done around preserving the koala corridor, and also the time that's taken since the original material change of use impact assessable application was lodged back in 2006. I do agree that a new application needs to be made. At the moment, this is one of the 2 to 4% of development applications that are refused. Consistently, between 96 and 98% of all development applications before Noosa Council are approved. All the applicant needs to do is abide by the Noosa planning scheme and the conditions contained therein. There is no shortage of very skilled planning consultants who can help an applicant in that regard to submit an application that's consistent with the Noosa planning scheme. But also, for me personally, I've yet to, I know I like to support staff in this, in giving approval to an application that has no clear specific information around building heights, or when it's been flagged that the heights are non-compliant. That would be, I agree with the staff, that would be negligent. So I cannot in all conscience support an approval for this application in its current form. I support the staff recommendation. Any other councillors wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Glasgow has returned. Joe, would you like to close?
Yeah, just adding that I'm a little confused at one of the points raised with regard to encouraging applicants here. The applicant already has a development approval on this site.
That's correct, Joe.
There's no encouraging them. They already have an approval. It's just a matter of that approval being meeting within the parameters of the planning scheme to fit upon the. I'm just talking, so that's my understanding. That approval can be given, provided that they meet the provisions of the site. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Could we please ask a question in relationship to that? What Councillor Drusley just said, and can you please clarify?
Sure.
Well, I will allow it. Yeah.
So the applicant does have an approval on the site that has lapsed. They sought extension to the currency period. We're in appeal over that at the moment.
Sorry. Thank you for clarifying. That they have had approval over the site
correct.
in the past. I should have clarified that.
Yeah, but we are in appeal over that because council refused that extension. They've appealed that, and we're in appeal over that at the moment.
Okay.
Put the motion. Those in favour? That is unanimous. Thank you very much.
I stand corrected. Thank you for clarifying.
Jess, can I just ask, unless it's a family emergency,
Yeah,
would you not take phone calls?
thing sorted, so I'm trying to sort that.
Pardon?
Grandma under the coronavirus, she's in a hospital.
Your grandma, okay.
I'm not a hospital doctor, so she's freaking out about it. I'm trying to dictate how to pick her up, how to get her home, isolation.
That's fine.
My dad's at work, I'm here. Sorry, everyone.
Thanks for letting us know. It's all right.
Okay, where are we up to?
Okay. Right. The agenda. Okay, so item 4 now, this is a further report. Development application for material change of use, 2 detached houses and 12 multiple housing type 4 conventional, and reconfiguration of a lot, 1 into 4 lots plus easement at 27 ATTUNGA Heights, Noosa Heads, and this is a report direct to the General Committee on page 6, the General Committee meeting agenda. Councillors.
So a question.
Yeah.
Councillor Stockwell.
Yeah. Is this the first time in 4 years that we've had a hat-trick of refusals?
I think it is, yes.
So just to clarify, the development application hasn't changed in any way, shape or form from that which came before us in June.
That's correct.
That's right.
Thank you.
I would, it's probably important in terms of information. Now, do we have a copy of the map or the site layout available to show or not? No?
Is it in the report?
Yeah, the attachment.
Sorry.
It is. Attachment 1 is the proposal plans.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So that was the original report.
Yes, the original report, which is some time ago. It's good to, I think, to just refresh our memories.
Thank you. Taking a while on that.
So which one is it?
It was the attachment to the general committee report.
It'll be in that report.
It's at the end of that, I think.
Attachment 1?
Attachment 1.
Attachment 1.
Yeah, at the very end is.
Yeah, there's one on page, proposed site plan on page 5 of it.
Yeah, if you go up.
And page 6. Yeah.
That would have been fine.
Mm.
That'll be fine.
Yep.
Is that alright?
That's fine with me.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Thank you.
Since the original report, the new planning scheme has progressed, and it would offer no more support for this type of development than the existing scheme would.
That's right.
And sorry if this question's been asked before. There's been no change to the application since it was refused by this council.
No change
previously.
and no further information put forward.
No, council didn't
We didn't-
refuse.
we
Oh, sorry,
didn't
sorry.
get to a
It
decision.
was recommended for refusal.
Yeah,
and
withdrew.
yeah.
And the applicant withdrew it, so
Beg your
that's why I was asked, that's what the first question I asked.
Well, they
Clara.
stopped
you,
the
Jo.
decision period, yeah.
So, coming from memory, in dim distant past, we had major slide slips that put sand all over Noosa COOROY Road, Noosa Drive, down to the hill. This is the country that contributed some of that sand, is that right? Or is this valid?
No,
I don't believe it was.
No, this
a long way further up the hill.
Yeah, that was further up.
It was to do with the previous development to the north of the site, yeah.
Yeah.
That they led to a.
There has been a landslip on this site. There's evidence of it, but I don't think it contributed any damage anyway.
My memory was it was just up that way, and I just thought this was part of the same.
You're talking about the one that closed the road? That's
Yeah.
right? No, that was
Further down.
Further up. Okay. But that issue is still there.
Yes.
Oh,
Any further questions for staff, councillors?
I'm happy to move.
Moved Councillor
I'll
Stockwell,
second it.
seconded Councillor Juricevic. Councillor Stockwell.
Yeah, so councils, it has been a while, but I recall when this development was advertised that there was considerable concern among the local community, and those concerns I think are well justified. This is a type of development that has always set Noosa apart by not approving it. We don't try and squeeze things into sites that haven't got the carrying capacity. And in this case, the natural hazards as well as the environmental values suggest that the carrying capacity of this site is significantly less than what is proposed in this development application. I think the grounds for refusal clearly set out the argument why this shouldn't proceed, and I think it is one of those developments that really is something that hasn't been consistent with the way we look at development in Noosa since the 80s, and therefore I'm happy to recommend its refusal.
I concur with Councillor Stockwell. It's a fairly constrained site with regard to what can and can't be developed on the site with regard to slopes and that, and I'm happy to support the staff recommendation for refusal.
No. Look, reason 3 makes it pretty clear. The proposed development is contrary to the specific outcomes in Noosa Head's locality code, contrary to population density, gross floor area, site cover, building height and setbacks. That's it in a nutshell for me. I support the recommendation. Councillors wish to speak? Wish to close, Brian? Put the motion. Those in favour? Councillors Jackson, Juricevic, Stockwell and Wilkie, and Councillor Glasgow was absent. Thank you. Thank you, planning staff. Thank you, Connor, Patrick, Kerry.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Welcome, Kerry Contini. Item 5, category D, bushfire recovery exceptional assistance immediate support package. Page 10 of the General Committee report. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Council. So this is the payment that we got notified of in early January, so post our 2019 bushfire. So initially we were advised of an exceptional assistance immediate payment of $1 million, which was further topped up by $275,000. And this is report today is to approve the program of works, which is the part of our condition of that funding. You'll see it's a general program of works because the QRA understand the changing nature of this and that within that time frame it's difficult to get specifics regarding costing or feasibility, etc. There's also the situation that additional funding is being notified, and so therefore it might be that something that potentially would have been funded out of this might actually be funded out of another avenue.
So just to clarify, Kerry, this is a proposed allocation based on some preliminary projects being proposed. If other funding alternatives arise that those projects can be funded out of, there may be a shift in the percentage allocation to each of those areas and the projects that are undertaken.
That's correct, Councillor.
And this allocation, but just to get through the process of administering that $1.275 million funding, we've got to go through this this understanding of where we believe the money will be spent.
That's correct, Councillor Drusovic. So this is not like another ordinary funding in this space. We put in an application that has costing around it. This is quite different. The funding has already been received by Council because it was in recognition of the immediate nature of the situation that local governments were in. So that's why there's quite general conditions around it, because it's up to each individual council in terms of the impact on their business and their community as to how they spent it, and they acknowledge that there's a changing funding scenario. For example, one of the items that we were looking at for this funding, which was around some repairs and improvements to some of our evacuation centres, there has been then a funding announcement that's come through last week, the announcement of a grant, and that grant program may be more suitable to that than potentially the 1.275 million. So the process that we would have going forward is to take this list of suggestions and assess them for feasibility and actual costing, and to then look, is it appropriate to fund them out of the 1.275 million, or should we submit them as part of another funding application?
Well, an example of that changing funding is it was $1 million originally, and an extra $275,000 became available. So that there's it's a shifting playing field where those funds are available from. Okay.
So is it the case then that what we have before us are general examples of the type of work that might be done rather than specific projects?
It would be the type. These are the types of projects that we've identified as being higher priority that could be funded out of this. We imagine that some will definitely be funded out of this because there's no other funding arrangement. So for example, where we have been supporting residents with where they've got waste so we're taking skip bins out, there's no other funding arrangement for that, and so it would come out of this funding. But there are others, for example, some of the economic development around tourism. There's actually two funding packages for bushfire impacted communities. There's a state one and a federal one. The federal one has been released, but the state one hasn't. So we keep watching that space to see which is most appropriate to apply to for funding. If at the end of the day we're not successful through those funding programs, we would come back to the 1.275 million and then look at it for using.
So can I just confirm also that because the offer by the government was that it had to be completed by June 22.
Yes.
And of course, we've placed that in there as the completion date. That's not really the completion date. It's more of a that's the final end date when it must all be completed. But there may be, once we've selected projects, some will be done with a much shorter time frame.
That's absolutely
Yeah.
correct. And indeed, some, because of the immediate need for, in some areas, the work is underway at the moment. So you're absolutely correct, Councillor Jackson. June 2022 is the final date, but some of those works would happen much earlier. So an example of that is where on North Shore, when we had the large equipment over there, it certainly did some damage to some of the tracks, churning up some of those access tracks. So we would start to do that work quite quickly.
Question about the 10% factored in to allow the projects to be delivered. That 10% would be used to hire external project managers to deliver these projects?
It would either be because we have to reallocate staff and then have to backfill those staff in their ordinary positions, or because we would have to bring in external contractors to do work. So some of this is about making sure that we've got the resourcing to actually deliver on these recovery activities.
Yeah, so it's an investment of 10% to get,
to ensure that we can
$127,000
yes.
to get $1.275 million.
So that we can ensure that we can deliver on the projects.
That just shows the challenge that we have within the resourcing of council. I mean, you know, a disaster of this type does take resources working on their normal activities out of the picture to fund that. I'm assuming.
Nice save. Was the question? What do you think?
Thank you for your question, Councillor Jurisi. Resourcing in the recovery phase is very intensive. One of the funding packages that was announced was recovery officer funding out of the state government. We are still awaiting clarity about that funding. So in the interim, we've got work that needs to proceed, and we will be utilising some of that funding to make sure that this work can actually commence.
I could have started that with does this.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you have here in your report as external consultation.
Yep.
And there was an online survey which you received 260 resident responses. I had another look, and I noticed it before at the Noosa Council Facebook page, which alerted people on Friday the 20th that they had to fill in the survey by Monday the 24th. They didn't seem to get much time to do that. And also, it says there was a media release here, or a press release, but I actually happen to have the Noosa Newses at home, and there was no, I've gone through the Noosa News in February, there was no alert in Noosa News, even if there was a media release. So I'm actually wondering how, that seemed like a very short time frame to allow people to respond. So what other initiatives, in order to get 260 residents, was that all that happened, or did you actually seek a lot of other ways to get people's input?
So it's a good point that you raise. The timeframes are quite short. So the information about this funding was announced in January, and then mid-January, and then they let us know that we had to have the program of works in by the 27th of March. So we felt, though, that it was important to engage with the community. Other councils haven't gone down that path given the short time frame, but we wanted to be able to do that. So we went out, we did a media release, we did do it on Facebook, and we sent direct communication. So, for example, highly impacted residents got a letter, so that they actually received a letter.
Asking them to fill in the survey.
Either asking them to complete the survey or to actually just share information with us, so their thoughts, so they didn't have to fill in the survey, they could just simply share their thoughts. And then we gathered the key stakeholders together in a round table to bring them together to discuss their specific ideas. I did request an extension of the time frame from the QRA. However, they consulted with the federal government and said that they could not provide an extension. QRA acknowledged the difficulty of the timing, given that I said that it was important that we actually took it to a council meeting, and so that actually brought forward the date, but they were unable to provide an extension. So we undertook community engagement as best that we could in the short window that we had.
So in some cases it was a 4-day window for people to know about it.
Yes, I mean, we certainly had the information out there earlier, but if they were picking it up from that particular Facebook message, it may only have been short.
Yeah.
Our intention though is now, and this is why they're general examples of what we would do, is to actually now go out and undertake much more detailed consultation. So, for example, one of the ideas proposed is to improve the park, or I guess barbecue shelter facilities in COOROY. That would be a way of spending the money. That would bring benefit to that community, would bring community members together. We now want to actually engage specifically with that community to see whether that's something that they want and what that would look like if they do want it. So further consultation will occur.
That's good, thanks.
Yeah. Just following on from Ingrid's question, were councils required to do public consultation to compile this piece of work to send back to the state?
No, thank you, Council. They were not required because this payment, I guess, was made to council for council facilities and council services. We, however, given that the impact from the bushfires is largely felt by our community, felt that it was beneficial to actually engage with the community, even though there was a very short time frame.
Yeah.
But there's certainly now scope out the other side to continue to do that. And that will absolutely be the case, for example, with our emergency services stakeholders who proposed some ideas, but we all agreed we needed to actually workshop those ideas together to ensure that we were delivering the benefit that we hoped we wanted to achieve.
The other thing is, I mean, whilst we didn't lose a great amount of community infrastructure in this instance, from what I understand, it gives us an opportunity to look at resilience and developing resilience plans perhaps within the spending?
So the community consultation that we did, that was reinforced to us, which is what we picked up when we actually did our initial recovery work, that the bushfires really changed a sense of feeling and anxiety within our community around preparedness for an event like that. And that what they then really wanted is some more concentrated work on how better to prepare.
So that is something from that community consultation that we got from the community saying this is the sort of thing.
Yes, so in the 260 respondents to the survey, 30% of those did not feel that they had now the ability to know exactly what they should do in an evacuation for a bushfire. Okay. So that helps us understand the scale of people's levels of demographic. Say, for example, they might be people who, older people living independently but having in-home services that might be more vulnerable. Or it could be a community that is one road in, one road out. So that's the type of work that would also come out of this.
Well, it would be fair to say in our LDMG planning we've got a lot of thought about flooding from past experience and like, but probably not as much on fire preparedness.
So that's the work that would be undertaken.
Okay. Councillors, we have a recommendation before us.
I might actually put a recommendation. It's slightly different because it's going to have another little words. Kathy, I'm just going to change it to saying to future council meetings rather than a future council meeting.
Because it's likely that it...
Yeah, now that we're listening to the process.
Look, I have no problem with that addition. I'll second that.
Yeah. Seconded. Councillor Jurisic.
Yes, I'll speak. This is extremely important to all of us. We've been faced with recent severe fire problems, and we're concerned that this might continue. So I'm particularly heartened that this has been supported by a grant, as well as the council will contribute to make sure this really happens. At the moment, the categories cover things like infrastructure, environment and hazard management, and community connection and resilience. Clearly all important things that need to be addressed, and the fact that this is going to involve more consultation, as well as, the most importantly, the inputs from the Queensland fire services and other expert people, means that we should be able to address things that are appropriate. I've added a little bit there to have this reported to council when specific projects are selected, as at the moment it's a broader brush decision, which I think would be very important, not only to council but for the public to be fully aware of what the wording at the end of the statement is, and further request the Chief Executive Officer to report the specific projects selected to proceed in each category to future council meetings. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, look, I said I'm glad we went out to the community on this one. I think the input that we got showed the areas of concern for the community, not just in having infrastructure replaced, but in how this funding could better prepare them for future events of this nature. Whilst the additional wording I think is a little redundant, because I'm sure it would have that every bit of spending always comes before council for consideration and in projects of this nature. I'm happy to see the change there that alludes to the public that they will become aware of where this funding will get spent in the future.
I have a question actually in relationship to this, either of Kerry or Miss either one, and that is that I was noted that today we are noting, we are not approving. So the wording of the recommendation is that we note the report
and approve the program.
Oh, we do approve
Yes.
the program.
Yeah.
So was there an intent to come back, and did council have to reapprove expenditure, or given that this is within the delegation of the CEO, was there intent that it would just
No, so our intention at this stage was to approve the program of work so that it could be submitted. Our understanding from QRA is that they may actually not even require any further program of works to be submitted, and simply for it to be acquitted at the end. Our intention then is to go through and do the feasibility and start to commence those projects, and then to regularly report back to council to say these are the bodies of work underway. And obviously we've now got multiple funding streams, and to let you know where those funding streams are coming from.
Thank you.
It'd be fair to say that their intent was there to not just assume the council would take the money, but to actually put some thought in process as to where that money would be spent.
Yes.
Yeah, I will speak to the motion. We would prefer not to have had to have this report. But I think it is also a good time to really place on record, from council's perspective, a huge thank you to what the community services staff have been doing since November. Truly well above and beyond what a normal council worker people perceive as, that really engaged with the community, really empathetic and really looking at the best outcome. And while the survey per se gives us some really good direction on how we break up the dollars, I think there's probably a greater good, and my understanding of community resilience, and particularly after disaster, is assuming control of getting that ability that we're part of that activity to decide how our future is going to respond, and that is building resilience, it is building leadership, and it's building connectivity. And so I think, I'm sure the community service staff understood that when they went out to the community, but it is really important to understand that part of that process of building resilience is about empowering the community to be more prepared next time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll reiterate that, Ryan. This is not the report we wanted to see at all, but 100% love to see you on it. You've been nothing but leadership on this, Kerry, and I congratulate whatever you've done on this. Is really inspiring to see what we did last few weeks ago next door, with all the figures of where it's going, and you've shown true leadership in this, and I applaud you especially and all your team, so thank you.
It's a team effort.
I'm going to pile on here and with the love and say that you and your team have brought great comfort and credit to the community, not just because of the way you handled the crisis when it was underway, and the comfort that you gave to the community members at the various facilities and the outreach programs that followed that. But I was particularly impressed that in order to get a tick of approval of the QRA for this money. Consultation is not required about the program of works, but you and your team chose to write individually to the community members who were affected by the fires and have input into this piece of work, and that you intend to do further consultation with those people and the community generally in getting more specific programs up and running. So, thank you.
Our pleasure.
Right, just to close, Ingrid.
I don't really need to close, although I would pile on as well and thank you and your staff for the excellent work.
They've done a
that you've been
fantastic
doing.
job.
Yeah, and that's appreciated, I think, by many people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Against? Is carried unanimously. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Graff.
Oh, finally got to the financial report. Mr. CEO, standing question.
Oh no.
What is that?
Stifling a yawn there, Ingrid?
You'll be pleased to know there's $43,000 of purchase orders with training on hand at the moment. So
I notice it's still a bit behind though.
yeah, but overall, in terms of what's been booked, we're looking good.
Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Graff?
Oh, sorry, just to flag that, the only rider on that is that I know that some of the training conferences are being cancelled at the moment over the next coming months.
And that'll be a challenge. That'll be a challenge, of course.
Yeah.
Didn't even think of that.
So
we may not have opportunities for.
correct.
Some
I'm
of
actually on a
that
board that does a lot of that stuff, and we this morning made some decisions to cancel some things, so it is going to be difficult.
Grant, 17.9% behind on capital expenditure, and we're below budget. It's the yellow one tag there. Why are we so far behind?
Councillor, it's purely timing of capital programs. For example, if you look at some of our major programs like Oriola Bridge, which is obviously construction commencement pending further work around to, the landslip there, or the road issue. Then there's been major projects such as Rufus Street Stage 3 with Rycon. So normally this time of year we're starting to kick through our budget review 3, which would pick up those minor adjustments and move the program around and push out to next year. So at this point in time, nothing significant, but it's purely just some of those larger projects. There's best been a slight delay on.
Is the wet weather impacting on Good Chat Street roundabout?
I'd have to take that one on notice.
All right.
Short answer is yes.
Yeah. So one does question the timing of in a wet season.
Well, the tricky thing there, Joe, is
we had to fit it in somewhere. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you also got to try and do it in the quiet period, which is normally February, March, in terms of number of visitors.
We're also constrained by Energex. I understand we're also constrained by Energex,
Telstra,
and all the rest of it. So
no great time.
Question, Councillor Drusik, does you recall when I suggested we started last spring when we needed to break the drought because I knew the rain had come?
Like washing your car. You want rain? Wash your car. Don't think there was any other questions I had. Those are the two main ones.
I might have a general request actually, which is related to this, and that is that we are every month receiving these very helpful reports which clearly tell us where we're up to, and we're, as Brett Giselle has just pointed out, the CEO has just pointed out that some things will have to stop due to the coronavirus issues. Trent, will it be possible as we go forward and receive these reports for you to give us some trending in relationship to expenditure and income, revenue that might be affected due to things like things stopping and not being able to be done due to coronavirus?
Councillor, yes, it will be something we will need to start tracking at this point moving forward, depending on how obviously the next week and months pan out. So even from a funding perspective, if there's any funding, obviously recovery funding available, it's something we may need to monitor. This sort of impacts we track anyway in terms of budgets, overs and unders. So it will form part of that, and obviously as we're aware that it'll obviously not just impact our costs for things like training, but also revenue impacts as well. So we'll continue to monitor that.
So would you then be able to report slightly, you know, aside from the standard report, which bundles everything together in a sense, would it be possible to somehow assess what the impacts are?
It would be something we could do periodic. I think to do on a monthly basis would be difficult, and down to that individual transaction level. In terms of the high level impact, particularly if it starts to have a sustainability impact on our cash reserves, and some revenue impacts, is something we will need to be aware of and to report to council. So it's something we can do periodically.
And some of that would be quite easy to capture, for example, and we're nowhere near
Trend that's not happening.
Well, or you know, we might need to close the pool or whatever. That's unlikely.
It's
at this
clear.
stage, but that's very clear and
because there'll be expenditure to keep it running and nobody can go there.
Correct. But other things like, you know, we might need to take staff off doing this function to do something else, and that then drops off, and you know, what's the hidden cost of that? So but overall, we probably need to turn our minds to that and just see. And the other question about whether or not there'll be funding available, because normally what we do in a disaster is capture all of our costs, and then you cover it under the natural disasters NDRRA. I don't think that will be the case here. I think
there's been no
all wearing our own costs, and we'll have to manage that.
There's been no national declaration of a disaster in this regard, although a pandemic has been declared. Can't be far off.
I'll watch this space, but I doubt whether the feds and the state will want to underwrite this one. We'll see what happens. Too early to tell.
Sorry, Brian.
For the secondary impacts, can you tell us your assessment of how exposed our investment in the Queensland Treasury Corporation is in terms of the stock market having a little bit of a dipsy doodle? Well, actually a huge one. But
at this stage, we haven't looked into that. So I'd have to take it on notice, and we'll extrapolate that more over the next few months as to what the impact will be. Obviously, being QTC compared to the commercial banks, who obviously have taken a quite significant dip over the last few weeks, we're obviously a lot more hedged in terms of gaining return above market. But we will definitely have an impact on that. At this point, I haven't looked into that.
But historically, any dips in the stock market turn around and come back with resurgence over time anyway.
Over time, it just depends.
It's a matter of what that time period
is. So, for example, even just before this event occurred, the larger banks were offering term deposit rates and investment rates that were a good between 0.3 and 0.5% lower than what we're currently getting through QTC. So if they're likely to take a dip, then it'll flow through at the same level. It will still be above what the banks are getting. But I'll take that on notice for future reporting, so we can provide information on it.
Thank you.
Trent, I've got some questions about waste budget estimates. Waste utility charges under rates and levies, 329,000 above year-to-date budget. That seems to be a lot, but in relation to the overall budget, is it? And are you comfortable with their estimates? Are they underestimating?
No, so relatively
accurately. Or
sure.
What's going on there?
Sure.
Why is it so?
So each year, as part of the budget process, we reassess all our rates calculations, general rates, as well as we do a special piece of modelling. We get an external consultant involved to do our waste modelling. This year, there was obviously some changes to the waste budgeting. We had the levy come in. So with the levy, what we had to do to ensure accurate pricing with waste levy for commercial and residential businesses, commercial businesses versus residential, as well as the fact that the levy didn't apply to recycling and green waste services. We had to unpack the levy. So you will see the rates notices that we don't have the bundled service anymore. And we had to unpack that. So a bit of the work in unpacking that was making sure we had at least a conservative baseline estimate, particularly for some of those mixed use and body corporate properties, to ensure that if we were too aggressive with our forecasting, then we'd be coming back this time with the opposite issue to have. So when we forecasted, we were conservative in that forecasting, and that's why you've got the overrun that we've seen come through this year.
You're only talking about 3%. It seems like an enormous amount of money when you're talking
dollars, correct?
When you're talking such a large budget.
Yeah.
It's a.
So what you've got is the better of the two problems to have.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
yes.
a
Absolutely.
approach
Yes.
rather than
Absolutely.
Above
approach.
budget,
And we were aware when we did the estimate of how we were breaking out those body corps and those bundled services, that we were on the conservative end. We also had to allow for the fact that we were unsure how much change management behaviour would occur in terms of people looking at their bin structure, particularly those industrial businesses or the mixed use, where they might have only had a single 240 recycling and a large bulk bin. Once they realised the price differential, they may have actually been encouraged to change their bin structure, which would have saved them money, but obviously then reduced our revenue. So we allowed for that in the bottom line.
Yeah, work in progress still happening.
Correct.
Okay, so under sale of goods and services, waste management, disposal fees and recyclable sales, 159k below year-to-date budget. What's happening there?
What's driving that? What you'll find is the major driver for that will be the pricing for one of our neighbouring councils for gate fees actually dropped this financial year. So the incentive for any collection trucks that were, say, Blah Blah or Twin Waters, and it was cheaper for them to come north, meant that they were instead returning to their local government area for pricing. So we've lost out, if you like, in terms of that we now have parity pricing or more comparable pricing between the two areas for gate fees.
Okay, so down under materials and services now on page 20.
Yes.
Waste management materials and services 361k below year-to-date budget.
Correct.
Primarily due to landfill and collection contract under expenditure. So that's the same principle.
So two couple of factors there. One is obviously yes, in the same way that the volumes going through the door has meant less revenue, then obviously the volume-based work involved for the contractor to do the work on site is less. On top of that, it's also about timing of some of the other waste management services on the site. So you've got concrete crushing, mulching. So it's also been about timing. So I think we're about due to start our next round of concrete crushing. So it's a timing issue there that we normally have done it earlier in the year.
We're holding up some of that.
That's a good thing.
Where the volumes coming through, so the volumes of commercial industrial waste that get crushed through the concrete crushing really is down to timing of the works. For example, Oriella Bridge replacement. The moment we start that piece of work, the amount of concrete that will need to be crushed at the landfill will be significantly higher. So
that's where it all goes.
That's right. So it is a bit of that market forces on timing for those works.
Thank you.
Question for the CEO. From an overview perspective, our financial management, considering the likelihood that we'll be in a technical recession and that the economic outlook will continue for some months to be poor, what risks and strategies are we likely to be exposed to, and are there any strategies that we should be thinking about to ensure that from a financial management perspective that we're still in a good spot in a year's time?
Yeah, very good question. The short answer is we've already planned for it because we made a decision to get to what I call a QDC sound rating. So we have deliberately built up our reserves so we can withstand any financial shock. And that's why QDC come in and have a look at what our financial position is so they can say we are at that level. So on a scale of 1 to 7, the old university sort of scale, we're at a 5, which is what that sound is. If I was a council sitting at a 3 or a 4, I'd be a little bit more nervous now in terms of what is my capacity or what is our capacity to handle a financial shock. So we're well positioned in being blunt. What sort of implications will there be? Some of the things will be people may not be as easy to pay their rates, as an example. So you might have less cash flow coming in. We're a little bit different from other businesses because our cash flow is protected. It's better than a first mortgage because if a property gets sold, we get the money and so on. So we actually have security around that. There's very little risk unless that amount builds up over time and we don't take action to recover it. So Michael and Kelly and the team downstairs already look at that on a monthly basis to have a look at what our rate arrears are. At this stage, we're not seeing any difference between what we would normally have in terms of rate arrears and what we currently have, but we can monitor that into the future. Other things is, discretionary income often gets knocked around. So will people still buy tickets to the J, or, to go to shows and things like that? So some of those discretionary things may change. On the upside, I've always found when I've been through a recession looking after council money before, you actually find that a bit more money comes out of the state and feds in terms of infrastructure, because they like to pump prime the economy. So there's opportunities around that in terms of what we can do to look at what's available. And that's why it's important to have, it's important to have our asset management plans. In fact, we've seen that at the moment in the last couple of years with our bridges program, where the feds have been spending a lot of money on bridges. That's one of their strategies. So we picked up, I think it's 5 bridges now where we've got 50-50 funding. We wouldn't have had that otherwise. So it swings and roundabouts, but as I said, our council, with its financial sustainability policy, is better managed to handle that than probably 3/4 of the councils in Queensland.
So the residents and ratepayers' assets and equity is looking pretty secure.
It is. The issues that we will face will be in the community in terms of impact on tourism sector, retail, all the discretionary type expenditures. So there will be some issues there that we need to manage. But as our own finances are concerned, we're in a very sound position.
Be able to continue providing good quality services and facilities for the community.
There should be no impact on our capacity to provide services.
Meeting closed.
Thank you.
I don't think we've
Tony, we have a recommendation before us. Anyone care to move it?
I'll move it.
Move Councillor Glasgow.
I'll second it.
Seconded Councillor Juricevic. Wish to speak to it, Councillor Glasgow?
Fine report, Trent, as always, keeping up to date with all our bits and bobs and the current climate in front of us. So look forward to the next report.
Thank you. Any other councillors wish to speak?
I'll just add a couple more things. So the other thing that will happen during this recession type or this downturn is I think there will be that continued pressure on interest rates. So our revenue from investments will probably be going down. But at the same time, we do have capacity to borrow. And I think there'll be low interest rate environment for borrowing as well. Credit may be squeezed in a bit in terms of if you were a council that didn't have the ability to pay back, you might have trouble getting that. I think the state will start to have a look at some of those more marginal councils a bit more closely about whether they'll extend credit, but our borrowing capacity is also very strong still.
But having said that, I mean, we're always fairly conservative with our estimates going forward in the budget, and the next budget's due in June, so I'm assuming there'll be a conservative estimate in the returns on investment in the next budget.
Yes, I think in particular for the 2021 budget, before we even entered the current situation with the pandemic, obviously we'd seen the market decline in the interest rates anyway, and we were already prepared for the fact that we needed to reduce reliance, if you like, in the budget on interest revenue, because regardless of what cash is in there, the return was dropping down below 1% anyway.
Just on that issue about the capacity to borrow, we've got the net financial liabilities ratio here, and the industry target is anywhere between 0 and 60%, is seen as a healthy range. Noosa Council's actual net financial liabilities ratio is negative 45.9. And the comment in the graph here is anything below 0 implies that liabilities are less than cash and other current assets. There's adequate borrowing capacity available if needed. So what is, in dollar terms, what does a negative 45.9% ratio mean in terms of how much could we borrow up to and still be in a safe range?
To start off with, just from a common perspective, the negative basically means we have enough cash today that we could pay off our debt and be in the clear. But obviously then we don't have any working capital to keep us afloat in the event of an economic decline where our revenue is dropping. So we obviously have we talk about, and the graph above it talks about cash cover. We need at least 3 to 6 months worth of cash in the bank to cover us in the event that we don't have normal revenue flowing in through the door. Our current asset base is approximately 850 million, I believe, in terms of non-current assets. So we can borrow, if we needed to, up to 60% of that, if you like. That's that.
Council, that's not a challenge, by
So 40% of that, it's that 60% ratio. So it's quite. So we could borrow if we were, and if you use a private sector enterprise as an example, often they'll have a level of gearing for their business, and at a point where they get beyond that 60% range, it's where it's obviously a risk if you have a market downturn like we've got now, or interest rates do go through the roof like they did in the late 80s. That's where the risk factor is at that high end, around the 60% mark. So we could borrow significantly if we needed to, but obviously for every $1 million that we do borrow, what that does mean year on year with the general rates is that there is an amount committed for 10 or 20 years, depending on the borrowing term, that we have to commit first and foremost to repaying our debts, rather than discretionarily towards service level changes or programs or anything that's coming through on an annual budget process. So there's always that timing factor in considering if you're borrowing now has a long-term impact in terms of availability to spend elsewhere. So we try to keep that balance quite conservative.
So a lot of that is due to the financial sustainability policy that this council adopted, which commits to returning a small surplus and also steadily paying down debt.
Correct, as well as a capital program that's been primarily focused on renewals and making sure we have enough funding to cover those renewals year on year with a sustainable renewals capital works program.
Thank you.
So the other reason why we're currently sitting at minus 46%, which is a good thing, is it's also the timing. We've got a lot of cash in at the moment with rates adjusting, so that gets run down between now and again. So
it's all down time.
But so that figure will approach zero.
No, it still sits steadily in the negative.
Yeah, but as we spend the money, that will go from 45.9 maybe to 40 or something.
Correct.
Yeah, it'll trend upwards.
Trend upwards, and obviously with that early repayment that we made last financial year, that swung that position around the negative more significantly because we had less debt.
Yeah. So even though it's sitting in a negative, it's positive.
Yes.
It's a very good positive.
Yes.
Correct.
Thank you. Any other councillors wish to speak to the motion?
As my question, I thank the CEO for his response, because I think it is really important that each month we get these, and it is a little bit of a lag indicator. But our role is really big to look at the lead indicators of where our financial position might be. And I suppose it'll be the big challenge for the next council, is to work out ways, not only does it keep the finances of this organisation, but is there mechanisms to play a bigger role in stimulating the local economy, and the CEO has mentioned a couple of those. Like normally during these periods you will have stimulus funding. Normally it is through public infrastructure. Having the right planning, whether it be for bridges or we're starting the whole Shire bikeway strategy, we can start to look at, I suppose the next council will do it, but look at how do we best allocate that funding to have not just get the infrastructure built so we're ready to go when the economy starts picking up, but also to give local people the biggest opportunity to participate in that. So there's also, I think, a council role in looking at the sort of contracts that are let. Does that actually suit our local workforce to stimulate, to try and drive money into the economy? And I think they're all going to be really big considerations in the coming months.
Any further comment? Question? All right, put the motion. Those in favour? Against? Carried unanimously.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Graf.
Thank you.
Councillors, thank you for your patience and attendance the last 4 years.
Yes, it's
The
our last
General Committee
for this council.